Hello, everyone. This is the fifth and final debriefing video for my second of my three CRISP lectures. This then closes out the handout that's on Spanish verb conjugation with special reference to Paita. This video covers appendices C, D, and overviews Appendix E, which is a presentation of almost the entire fragment as it currently stands. Appendices C and D present the complete paradigms for the verbs ser, which is to be, and ber, which is to see, and sketch is what I have in mind for these rather irregular paradigms, rather special paradigms, I should say. All right, here we go. This is Appendix C. I'm just going to make sure that this is appropriately embiggened. All right, there we go. Here we are. So this is the appendix. This is Appendix C, the paradigm of ser, to be. Okay. And the different shaded areas here correspond to different looking stem forms, or where the stem forms are different looking enough that they require special treatment. So, and the unshaded shells correspond to what those that involve what I take to be the default elsewhere allomorph, which is just an S, such that the air here is the theme vowel, right? But looking at the cells with shading, we've got the present indicative, which is pretty extraordinary. It's got what looks like 3, 4 separate stems, although I don't think that's what it is at the end of the day. So it's soy, eres, es, somos, sois, son. Okay. And then if I go down to the present subjunctive, we've got sea, 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 seamos, seais, sea. Okay. The imperfect indicative, so regular in the rest of the language. B is one of the handful of verbs that has an irregular looking imperfect indicative. So we've got era, eras, era, éramos, erais, eran, where the stem looks like it's this er thing, which also turns up in eris, the second person singular, familiar, present indicative. And unusually for a second conjugation verb, no apparent manifestation of the theme vowel at all. Okay, so it's not like eria or anything, or sia or anything. It's just this ah here, right? Then we've got the preterite and the related tenses, which all have some kind of form in fw. So it goes in the preterite indicative, fui, fuiste, fue, fuimos, fuisteis, fueron. And then the Paita pattern, again, you get the stem for the imperfect and future subjunctives by taking fueron and subtracting the sequence ron. So fuera, 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 etc., etc. At the bottom of this page, I've got a set of rules of exponents that account for this paradigm, or at least almost do. We'll get to that in a second. But the idea is this: 142a. This form is, as it were, the default for non-perfective indicative forms. So that on its own guarantees that it turns up in the imperfect indicative, and that it doesn't turn up in the preterite indicative. The fact that it turns up in a second person singular present indicative will be the result of an impoverishment rule affecting that form, which we'll get to in a second. 142b is an allomorph, which is spelled out in minus present plus finite environment. So the Paita pattern, again, the morphosyntactic part of it. The underlying representation inserted by this rule is one which has on the timing tier CV, CV, such that the first C is filled by an F, and then the remaining timing slots are unfilled, but there is a W floating on the melodic tier after the F. Okay. Then in 142C, there's a rule that specifies for plus present plus indicative minus perfect, right? Which will, in the present tense, generally be 142A, except when the present tense feature is deleted by an impoverishment rule, which will happen in the second person singular familiar, giving you eres instead of sos. But if you don't have that rule, you'll get sos, and that's what Bosse-Ante dialects have. Okay. Which is to say, dialects of Spanish that use the pronoun must for second person singular familiar, as opposed to du. Okay. What this rule inserts is an underlying representation with CV and nothing else on the timing tier, such that the C is linked to an S, and then there's a floating O on the melodic tier. 142B is the form that's inserted in just in the present subjunctive, and it's CV on the timing tier linked respectively to an S and an E. And then there's a default rule in 142E, which is just CV on the timing tier with the C slot filled by an S and nothing else. And that's the default. And that's the form that, by hypothesis, is being used in all of these cells of the paradigm that aren't shaded. Okay. And the V is coming to be occupied by the theme vowel of the second conjugation. Now, one thing that's worth saying here is that at the moment, I predict that the third person singular preterite indicative fue should come out as four. That's incorrect, obviously. I'm actively experimenting with ways of fixing this, but they're even less, those ways that I'm experimenting with are even less ready for presentation than what I'm about to tell you. So I won't say anything further about that problem here. As well as this, I've entertained a hypothesis which gets rid of all of these rules except for 142B and replaces the remainder with an underlying representation that consists of a single linked consonant with an unfilled V slot, where the consonant is a continuant underspecified for obstruency and voicing, which will surface as S if it gets filled in as minus voice and plus obstruent, and as R if it gets spelled out, if it gets filled in with minus obstruent plus voice. And that's the sort of more minimally suppletive idea, and this capital Z here is what I would use to represent that segment. However, getting the phonology to work consistently for this case and for the same segment that has to be part of the underlying form of the verb querer, see Appendix B and E, is not easy. That minimally suppletive analysis also makes it difficult to account for the vowels that follow the S in these two rules. So why do we get a floating O here and an air here, and why do we get an air in the forms in yellow? Where those vowels come from exactly, it's very, very difficult to get that to work out properly if you try to pursue this minimally suppletive analysis of the paradigm. So I haven't. The form R will get inserted in the second person singular present indicative thanks to a special impoverishment rule given as 167 in Appendix E. Another impoverishment rule, 170 in Appendix E, will guarantee the absence of a theme vowel in the present and imperfect indicative forms. As it stands, there's no rule in the system that specifically handles the third person singular present indicative form, which is S. Leaving things as they are will leave the rule back in 142C, the one which has an S and a floating O, to apply in the third person singular present indicative 2, apparently incorrectly. I see two possible fixes for this, which have in common the idea that the initial air of S is epenthetic. So the first possibility would be that there's a phonological rule that strips out a word final floating O. This will be okay and won't over apply in such a way that it mispredicts the first person singular present indicative, because that underlyingly is not just a floating O, it's a floating O followed by a floating yod. So that will be unaffected. So if we add such a rule to the system, then underlying SO word boundary will have the O stripped out before it links, and then you'll have just an S on its own, and a parenthesis will apply to give you S. Another possibility is that the TAM node in this form is obliterated by an impoverishment rule, crucially ordered after the impoverishment rule that gets rid of the theme vowel by the cyclic principle in the relevant forms, causing the default to be the winning allomorph. So you'd be getting rid of the tam node entirely in the third person singular present indicative. You would, and that wouldn't bleed the rule that gets rid of the theme vowel because that will apply first because it applies to a node that's lower in the tree. That will mean that the rule in 142C will be over-specified by the time you're doing vocabulary insertion so that the default will win. And when you've got a default, the default is just an S attached to the timing tier. The theme vowel is gone, so that is another thing that you have to fix via appendices. So those are the two possibilities that I'm entertaining there. It's not clear how to choose between those. Okay, so that's what I've got in mind for SER, basically. There's the actual impoverishment rules alluded to here are given a formulation in Appendix E. Right then, Appendix D, the paradigm of Ber to C. Okay, so the sort of unusual looking cells are the ones that are shaded here. So we've got the present indicative beo, bes, be, beamos, beis, ben, and the present subjunctive bea, beas, bea, beamos, beais, beam. Now, the curious thing about the orange shaded cells is that they seem to indicate that they're consistent with the idea that the root is be. Okay. But the remaining forms here aren't consistent with that. In particular, because of very similar looking verbs like the verb that means to read, which is leer, right? So Leer in the orthography. And that goes leo, lees, le, leemos, leis, leen. Sorry, leen. All right. So if the root were underlyingly be, then Spanish has no problem in principle with having two airs next to each other. So that wouldn't account for the fact that you've got bes, be, bemos, beis, ben, as opposed to bes, right? So the forms that are unshaded here seem to call for an underlying representation of the root, which is underlyingly just a b, right? Having said that, the imperfect indicative again looks like it's got a root that's be, followed by the theme vowel, followed by the imperfect indicative marker. But the preterite and related tenses again look like they're more consistent with the notion that the underlying representation for the root is b, right? Because then you just have b, then the theme vowel would dock, and you get b, biste, right? Bieron via accented I lengthening and everything, right? And then, of course, we've just got the past participle bisto, which it seems you'll have to say something special about, even though it does overlap in its segmental phonology with the rest of it. So here's what I've got in mind for this, okay, tentatively. So there'll be three rules of exponents corresponding to this verb. One of them is given in 144A. So this inserts an underlying representation, which is CV, CV, where the first C is filled by be, b, and the second and the first V slot is filled by e, right? And that's going to be inserted in the imperfect indicative only. Okay. Then there's the rule in 144B, which is for the past participle. So this just inserts bis, right, which is going to be CV, CV. The first C has b in it. The first V has I in it. The second C, sorry, has S in it. Bis, okay? All linked to the timing tier. And then the default allomorph is this one, which is very much like 144A, except that the air is floating. And the tentative idea is that the floating air of the elsewhere allomorph is stripped out by an early rule, which bleeds floating vowel association. If there's a floating vowel switch right, which is mine's back, right? So we need these two separate underlying representations because absent that, we'll be stripping the same vowel out in the imperfect indicative, and that gives you the wrong answer. You predict bia where you get bia. Okay. Wow, look at that seamless edit. I realized as I was talking through this that this bullet here, the hope that rule that I just described may play a role in explaining the L-shaped morpheme as it rises in the present tense paradigm of severe and cohere does not work, in fact. So ignore that. That's another problem to think about. But just for the rest of this video, I want to show you what's the general idea of what's in Appendix E. I'm not going to discuss much of this in detail, except to draw your attention to a few things that relate to the earlier appendices. The first subsection of Appendix E is the pieces, the inventory of syntactic pieces that can be put together by merge. I'll dwell on one here. This is number 149, and it's B, right? The piece that's inside all of the different variants of B that there are in Spanish, and a few other verbs via lexical decomposition. So it has the second conjugation class features, it has the pretérito grave class feature, and it has this additional feature which is picked out by a rule that deletes the theme vowel in certain environments that we'll see in a second. Otherwise, though, it's a fairly standard looking verby type thing, verbalizer, that happens not to select or breed. Okay. Now, if I just float through here, this is all the pieces. Some rules of impoverishment. There's the general rules of impoverishment that are talked about in the main body of the talk. Here are some impoverishment rules that are associated with B in particular. So this is a rule which deletes the feature, which is targeted by another rule deleting the theme vowel. And it does this to explain the fact, so quite a lot of the parts of the paradigm of ser are athematic, even when verbs that are built on ser, like estar and tener, aren't. And so to account for that fact, one has to specify B itself as having a feature that triggers theme vowel deletion, and then get rid of that feature in these environments. And that's the only way to do this because of that natural class reasoning of the kind that logical phonologists have drawn our attention to in phonology. So given lexical decomposition, tener, estar, and friends are featurally, if you don't have a feature like plus theme deletion and a rule deleting it, more richly specified than B is, right? And yet we need to say special statements about theme vowel deletion that apply to ser and not to the rest of them. And this is the only way to reconcile that. Then we have this rule here in 167 that was mentioned in the discussion of the paradigm of ser. So delete the present tense feature in what environment? Well, when you've got VB there and you've got the TAM features, which are minor subjunctive, and the agreement features are second person singular. So this will get you er as the stem that's inserted for the second person singular. And then this footnote here says, this rule is absent or optional in Bossiante dialects. Where it applies, we get eris for use singular informal. That the second here must be epenthetic, given that the present indicative of ser is athematic by rule 170, which we'll get to in a second. Where the rule 167 doesn't apply, we get sos as the second person singular indicative form, and that's as desired. Here are impoverishment rules deleting the theme vowel. So this is relevant to heteroclasis, like in the video that discussed Appendix A, and to athematicity generally. So, for example, 168 is the rule that gets rid of the theme vowel in special future indicative and conditional forms. So this is why, for example, poder gives you podré for I will be able to rather than poderé. Likewise, why querer gives you querré for I will want instead of the expected quereré, right? Likewise, here for the past participle, so lots of past participles are athematic. That's this rule here. 170 is the rule that gets rid of the theme vowel of ser in a great many environments, including the present indicative and the imperfect indicative, crucially. 171 is the theme vowel deletion rule, which is relevant to the heteroclite verbs, right? So that's going to delete the outer theme vowel in the piter forms. And then in 172, cumulolus constraint generalized will get rid of the inner theme vowel in all of the circumstances. 173 has so the section 7.5.3 is sample rules of exponents. 173 here are selected interesting third conjugation roots and the vowel quality alternations that in our interaction with the rule system I discussed in the second part of this debriefing, the second video, give rise to them. 174 has preterito grave roots. There's a few features of these that I want to draw attention to. So one is, querer, the rules of exponents in the main body of the talk have a allomorph quis inserted in the preterito grave environment. And the allomorph care with a floating CV. Elsewhere, this rule collapses those. So you've got one underlying representation which has a final z, which is a coronal continuant that's underspecified for obstruency in voicing. And the idea is that in the preterito grave forms, the presence of the floating feature bundle that gives rise to the vowel raising in the preterito grave will be the trigger for a rule which fills this z in as minus voice plus obstruent, so that gives you S. And elsewhere, there'll be a rule that assigns it plus voice, or a pair of rules, unification rules that assign it plus voice and plus obstruent, minus voice and plus obstruent. Plus voice, minus obstruent, and that gives you R, right? And the extra CV will be stripped out by empty CV stripping in the preterito grave, but will remain in place elsewhere. So that gives you surface alternations between care, kier, and quis, okay, in interaction with the rest of the rule system. The verb to do is underlyingly so this is a low vowel underspecified for plus minus back, and a floating th or a floating s in Latin American Spanishes and Spanish is spoken in the south of the Iberian Peninsula. Just want to draw your attention to the rule of exponents for come here. So this is underlyingly B, E, empty CV sequence, N, and then a floating velar underspecified for voicing. And when that velar docks, you don't get the diphthongization. So we get vengo, vienes, viene, and so on. Likewise, tener goes tengo, tiene, tienes, right, and so on. Now, so the surfacing of the floating velar correlates with a lack of expected diphthongization, and the reason for that is the one found in Cavirani 2021. So the idea is that the velar steals a timing slot, which would otherwise make room for the diphthong. I haven't cashed that idea out yet in a LaTeXifiable form that so that it can appear in the phonological part of this fragment, but that's the idea I'm going to be appealing to ultimately. Now, here's an interesting thing about Spanish, though. So Cavirani's discussion is in the context of Italian, which doesn't give rise to this issue that I'm about to describe. So the singular imperative forms of venir and tener are ben and ten. So that means come and have such a thing, right? Now, you've got stress on that vowel there, but there's no diphthongization. And that suggests that the velar links to the timing tier during the derivation of these forms before being deleted in word final position. So the idea is that ben and ten are special in being the root of all their specialness is their athematicity. So the theme vowel is deleted in these forms for some reason. I don't think I formulated the relevant theme vowel deletion rules for those yet. So they're not here, but there'll be an additional one of these theme vowel deletion rules, which gets rid of the theme in the singular imperative forms of these verbs and a few others, including, for example, hacer and decir, right? And that will mean that there's no minus back vowel to the immediate right of the velar, which would then mean that the way we want to think about this velar disappearing is that it's not that it is floating and links only when it's followed by a back vowel, but rather that it links all the time so long as it's not stripped out. And it's stripped out when there's a minus back vowel to its right. So what that would lead to is in the derivation of a form like ben or ten, there'll be a stage at which the velar links to the timing tier and steals the relevant timing slot, so you don't get diphthongization. But then in Spanish, word final velars And in particular, I mean, word final velar quite generally, I think, but word final velars preceded by an N certainly are deleted by an automatic rule because those aren't allowed to surface, right? Um, so there's a stage where the velar is there, it blocks diphthongization, and then it's deleted later. This is also suggested by the fact that in Catalan, dengo comes out as tink. So Catalan doesn't have the same surface prohibition of word final velars, and so the velar surfaces in that form, which means that for Catalan you would have to say that it's that not that it only links before back vowels, because there are forms where there's no vowel that follows it, right? Rather, it links always except when stripped out, and it's stripped out before a linked following front vowel. Some selected verbalizers here. The ones that deal with the vowel alternations in the pretérito grave verbs are given here. So 175D is the one that gives you the vowel raising effect in the vowel raising subclass of pretérito grave verbs. 175F gives you the mid vowel that appears in quepa and sepa, as opposed to sabe and gabe, right? And 175E is worth drawing attention to. So this is the floating velar that's connected with verbs that don't have it as part of their underlying representation of the root, which leads to the velar in question not being present in the pretérito grave forms and therefore not leading to yod deletion. So there's rules for the copular quartet and related verbs here. So this deals with the paradigm of ser, the paradigm of tener, the paradigm of haber, and the paradigm of estar, and dar, which is built on the same, dar being the verb that means to give, which is built on the same structure. There's the theme vowels, tam morphemes, and deverbal derivational morphemes. You'll recall that these parentheses here, not the parentheses, the curly brackets are boundaries for the edge marking rule, and the left parentheses here are projected to line 0 as part of footing, and here are the agreement morphemes. Nothing particularly to see here except that just to remind you that the first person singular agreement morpheme is spelled out as oi, both components floating in the present indicative. And ordinarily, only the floating O will get to link. It will link to an available V slot. The yod won't get to link ever, except when the O ends up being stressed, because exactly in that circumstance, CV in fixation will place an empty CV sequence right where yod needs it. And so that's why you get doi, soy, and boy, and estoy. But otherwise, you just get O. And then there's the phonological rules. Here it says some rules described in the appendices omitted. So a lot of the rules that I've conjectured to be possible additions to this fragment are not included here. There are just a couple that I want to draw your attention to that are included, but weren't mentioned at all in the main body of the handout. And these are rules 180 and 181. So rule 180 says, if a floating low vowel precedes a vowel that has projected a left bracket to line 0 and no fill consonant slot intervenes, delete the floating vowel. So you're going to delete a floating vowel before a affix that is underlyingly an accented vowel, right? And we need this in order to explain preterite forms in the first conjugation, in particular the third person singular present the third person singular preterite indicative forms, because otherwise we'd expect hablao and not hablo. Okay. Rule 181, so that rule 180 is called pretonic floating vowel stripping, general. Because that's the version of it that applies in the general case. There's a special version of it that will need to apply in the pretérito grave. This targets not only floating low vowels, but floating vowels generally. So it says, if a floating vowel precedes a vowel that has projected a left bracket to line 0 and no fill constant slot intervenes, delete the floating vowel. So this is needed to account for the fact that you don't see the theme vowel at all in the third person singular preterite or preterital grave forms, right? So in particular, you'll recall I managed to do something comes out as not as pudio or anything, or podio or pudio, but as pudo, right? And that's going to be from underlying pod, the floating realization of the verbalizer that's associated with the preterital grave, floating theme vowel, and then the underlyingly accented O of the preterite, which is the spell out of the tam morpheme in the third person singular. Okay. Before the rule of floating vowel association applies, and before the general accent assignment rules apply, this rule will apply and strip the theme vowel out. So that's why we'll end up with pool, though, by the end. The accent assignment rules will end up meaning that this underlyingly accented vowel doesn't surface with the stress on it. And yes, just one final thing to highlight here. Here is the extra special edge marking rule that will give you that result in the preterital grave. Okay, so this, unlike the others, assigns a right parenthesis to the left of the rightmost element, which will have the desired effect. And then the remainder of these rules are ones you've already seen. This is all of the rules that appear in the main body of the talk corresponding to part 2 of this debriefing, the one that talks about the non-automatic vowel alternations in Spanish. And that's it. That is the end of the debriefing of my second CRISSP lecture. The third CRISSP lecture was on vowel alternations in Sumerian, and my attempt to deal with them without appealing to suppletion, which you need to do if you want to avoid transderivationalism and or look ahead in the analysis of Sumerian. Okay. That lecture is probably going to split over 2 videos because it's not quite as heavy on the appendices as this lecture was. By the way, probably see you next week.